There we go. The Policy Leadership Academy brings together stakeholders and community residents to understand and address local, statewide, and federal issues through a shared knowledge of causes and impact, current problem-solving frameworks, and best practices and actions to address change with an emphasis on policy. And if you can take a moment, as I mentioned, the timeline, we have February, March, April. We're going to have speakers in all of February, speakers all in March, and speakers in April, though before the last will be dark. So we will have a brief pause and then we will recap and take a survey. So that is what it looks like for the upcoming months. And before we get started, I would like to mention if you are needing this in Spanish or if you want to hear this in English, you can choose your language. And I'm going to turn this over to Carmen, our translator. We do have two translators currently, Carmen and Carlos, if you do need to connect with them. So please, let's just take a moment and have Carmen explain if we do have people who are wanting to hear this in Spanish.
Buenos días y bienvenidos. Si necesitan interpretación y están en su computadora o su computadora inalámbrica, abajito en su tablero van a mirar un mundo. En ese mundo van a poder elegir el idioma de preferencia. Si están en su teléfono celular o una tableta, van a mirar 3 puntitos en el tablero donde dice more o más y ahí pueden elegir el idioma de preferencia. Gracias.
Thank you, Carmen. And so now I'm so excited, so pleased to introduce Andres Chavez, the Executive Director for the National Chavez Center. The topic will be civic engagement, and I'm going to turn it over to my director, Sylvia, to introduce Mr. Chavez. Sylvia?
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning and welcome, everybody. As Tracy said, we're super excited to have Andres Chavez with us here today and kick off our third cohort of the Policy Leadership Academy. So as the Executive Director of the National Chavez Center, Andres Chavez leads the arm of the Cesar Chavez Foundation and educates and promotes the legacy of his grandfather across the nation. He also oversees 2 historic properties, including La Paz in Keene, California, where Chavez lived and labored his last quarter century, a portion of which is now Cesar A. Chavez National Monument that the NCC manages in partnership with National Park Service. As the Director of Strategic Initiatives with the Cesar Chavez Foundation, Andres moved forward new foundation initiatives and projects, assisting its 4 funds: communications, housing, economic development, education, and the National Chavez Center. The youngest son of Socorro and Paul Chavez, Cesar Chavez's middle son, Andres was raised at La Paz in the farm worker movement. Andres grew up greeting visitors, taking them on tours, and sharing his grandfather's history, as well as participating in countless marches, rallies, picket lines, demonstrations, and political campaigns. Andres graduated magna cum laude from Cal State University, Bakersfield in 2016 with a bachelor's degree in public policy and administration. He was active in student and community life, organizing immigration right rallies, the first campus Hispanic Heritage Month observances, and opening a community garden in an underserved neighborhood. After serving as political director for Emilio Huerta's Valley Central's campaign in California's 21st Congressional District, he helped establish the high school equivalency program at the Cal State University, Sacramento, helping farm workers obtain their GED degrees. Andres worked with the California State Fair and Exposition, the public agency running the state fair, aiding its legislative outreach and lobbying efforts. Again, please help me welcome Andres Chavez.
Thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate it. And good morning to you all. I'm excited to be with you. Just first, on behalf of the National Chavez Center and the Chavez family, we appreciate the invitation to be with you all this morning and talk a little bit about civic engagement, something that I was certainly brought up knowing even before I knew what the term civic engagement was. But it was just something that we were kind of born with, and we knew that we had an obligation to participate in the civic and public affairs of our community. I'm going to pull up a presentation. As you saw, the presentation is going to talk about civic engagement, and then we'll open it up to Q&A afterward. So Let me go ahead and begin sharing here. And Sylvia, sorry you had to read that long presentation, that long introduction. We got to work on shortening that up a little bit. So I made a note of that.
You worked hard, you own that. You should share it.
Well, I'm laughing because the next slide that I get into gets into some of this stuff already. So
Did he freeze or is it us?
No, I think it's him. I think he froze. So let's hope that he comes back. Yeah. So we'll wait and see. Let's see, and I'm going to.
we have radio. The Chavez Foundation has radio stations, and I came to the radio station because this is where we have, exceptional internet because of all our streaming. And so I don't know what happened. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, there we go. My apologies. So as you all heard, I'm the executive director at the National Chavez Center. Really what our job is to do is we make sure that my Tata Caesar's legacy remains relevant, and that we teach the important lessons and values that he taught us all, and that he exemplified in his work with future generations. We really believe that at the core of his work, there was some basic core values that we think resonate today. And so we do so through the management of historic properties. You mentioned the Cesar E. Chavez National Monument. In 2012, just about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, President Barack Obama came to our headquarters just outside of Tehachapi, California, to proclaim it a national monument. If you haven't visited us yet, I encourage you to do so. I'd be happy to leave my I'll leave my email in the chat box once we finish up. And if you and your family want to come up and my schedule allows, I'd love to give you a tour. It's also the location where I lived at for the first 18 years of my life. And so I know a lot about that place. We also have the 40 acres, which was the original home of the farm worker movement. And that's also a federally designated historic site that we manage. And then we create educational programs and cultural programs to teach folks about the work of the farm worker movement and my Tata Caesar's legacy. I mentioned I grew up in the farm worker movement. I grew up there in La Paz, but I mentioned that civic engagement was something that was kind of ingrained in us and that we had to do from a very young age. Fortunately, I liked it. And so that was helpful to me. But, I participated in a lot of marches and rallies and different protests and pickets, and then began, as I started getting older, participating in political campaigns. I went to California State University, Bakersfield, where I remained to be active. I'm involved in our alumni association. I'm actually the president-elect, now I think about it, of the Alumni Association. So if any of you are CSCB alumni, be expecting to hear from us. I know that there's a big extended university out in the Antelope Valley. I studied public policy and administration there. And then afterwards, I moved out to Sacramento. And while I was in Sacramento, I worked at the State University, where we had the high school equivalency program, where we worked with farm workers or the sons and daughters of farm workers to get them their GEDs. And then once we got them their GEDs, we'd work to place them into either workforce development programs or get them enrolled at a local community college. And so that was some of the work that we did. And we also helped out with job placement. So that was interesting. And then I got a call from the Cal Expo and the State Fair, and they were looking for somebody to do some legislative outreach and advocacy for them. And so I worked at the State Fair, and we used to host legislators and take them on tours of our site and talk about the needs of the fair community, which was kind of an interesting thing. It was something different. And so that's why I took on the challenge. And then I mentioned doing some work in political campaigns. I worked on Emilio Huerta's political campaign when he ran for Congress in 2016. And so that was an interesting experience. If y'all haven't been on a campaign yet, I encourage everybody to do at least once, even if you're just a volunteer. I was working full time, and from being a volunteer, the difference between being a volunteer and being on staff is a world of difference. And it could be quite intense, but it was a good experience nonetheless. So what am I going to talk to you all about today? Today, I'm going to talk with you all about civic engagement through the lens of my Tata Caesar. But before we get into that, I think it's important that we know what the definition of civic engagement is. When you look at the dictionary definition of civic engagement, it's articulated as individual and collective actions designed to identify and address public issue and address issues of public concern. And so, just by looking at that, this is a very, very big and broad definition of what it means to be civically engaged. And by looking at some of the Zoom backgrounds that you all have and looking at some of the organizations you all are with, a lot of you are civically engaged as we speak. I think even the fact that we're here today and that you're participating in this Policy and Leadership Institute would stress the point that you are civically engaged. I mentioned that it can take place in a lot of different forms. There's obviously community service and volunteerism, organizational involvement, so maybe through your professional work, but maybe through volunteering as well. Electoral participation, registering people to vote, getting involved in political campaigns, maybe being a poll watcher and getting involved at the polls when it comes time to do that. If there's recount efforts, participating in those efforts. Those are different ways of that there's civic engagement. Activism and advocacy. That's where I'm most familiar with civic engagement. It could be as simple as you picking up a sign and going out to a march. Advocacy, going and talking to your local representatives, demanding that there be more streets with better lighting, or that we need curb gutters and sidewalks because there's poor infrastructure. When we have big nasty rains like we recently had, we see that low-income communities get rocked by them and their homes begin to flood. So there's that type of work, but then there's also philanthropy, right? And philanthropy can happen in different ways. Sometimes it could be giving dollars. Other times it can be donating food to the local food bank, right? And so I think the beautiful thing about civic engagement is that there's so many ways that you can do it, and it's such a broad topic. What I'm going to get into is the way that my Tata Caesar viewed civic engagement. And I saw that some people were raising their hands. Tracy, if you don't mind, I can just get through this and then we can move on to Q&A afterward.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if we have questions, if we can please hold the comments until after Mr. Chavez is done, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. So, as I was preparing this presentation, I'm lucky enough that I still work with people who worked alongside my Tata Caesar. And so I began talking about this presentation, and it became very clear to me that my Tata viewed civic engagement in really three tenets. The first one was service. The second one was participation. And the final one was empowerment. And empowerment is a really important one. And so what I'm going to get into over the next few slides is I'm going to talk about each of these tenets. And I'm going to grab words from his speeches, different speeches and talks that he gave. One of them was actually through a letter where you're going to see him articulate kind of these thoughts that he had on civic engagement and why people should participate. And then kind of walk away with some of the takeaways of each of those tenets of civic engagement. And then the final thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you civic engagement in practice. And it was a process that I was recently involved in that also involves policy. So I figured it was a perfect kind of marriage of the two, thinking about this leadership academy. And we're going to finish up with kind of a policy story. So that's what we have in store for today. So service. My Tata Caesar fasted in 1968 for 25 days. This was during the famous Delano grape strike that some of you may have read about or learned about while you were in school. Delano grape strike was really the historical event that brought the forefront and the plight of farm workers to the American public. At the time, people would go to the grocery stores and they knew how they would go and kind of buy their food, but very few people, and even till this day, realize the sacrifice that went into getting that food on your table. The blood, sweat, and tears that mothers and fathers, just like yourselves, labored in on a daily basis, the horrible working conditions. During this time, it was a 5-year period. There was a lot of different events that took place, including a march from Delano to Sacramento. And the efforts of the grape strike began to really began to be successful. And the farm owners, they had two favorite tactics at the time. One tactic was that they used to pit the races against one another. So during labor disputes in particular, when Filipino farm workers would go out on strike, they'd go and grab the Mexican or Latino workforce and they'd have them break their strike. But they were always trying to pit the races against one another, always trying to create kind of the old divide and conquer strategy, if you will. And so when Filipinos and Latinos joined together in 1965, it was actually Filipinos who started the Delano grape strike. When they joined together, it was really the birth of a multicultural movement that would forever change America. And because of that strength, the power that they had in numbers, the power of the people, the coalition style of organizing, they began to be successful. And so the growers turned to their second favorite tactic, which was using violence. And farm workers began to retaliate because they'd been on strike for 2.5 years now. Many of them had lost their homes, they had lost their cars. But my tata, believed in nonviolence. He had been a disciple and had read most of Gandhi's works, if not all of his works. He had closely followed Dr. King's struggle in the South. And he also thought that his movement needed to be a nonviolent movement. After fasting for 25 days in 1968, he was too weak to speak on that Sunday where Senator Robert F. Kennedy joined him on that historic day. And he wrote a statement. And in the statement that he wrote, it was probably about a 500-600 word statement. But in there, he put this quote in there. And he said, "It is my deepest belief that only by giving our lives do we find life." And if you look at those words, at the very core of that statement is this idea of service, this idea of giving back to others, this idea of giving back to your community. My thought I would often share with people that there was two kinds of service. There was being of service and there was being a servant. Being a servant was kind of an act that everybody could participate in. This is folks who were boycotters, folks who they asked to not buy grapes. This was suburban house moms in the Midwest who maybe couldn't make their way to California to volunteer full time, but the contribution that they could make is they could stop buying grapes. These are folks who donated money and donated food. They knew farm workers were on strike. They were struggling. They were hungry. Their kids were hungry. And so they would send monthly donations, maybe $5 a month, or maybe they would get whatever leftover scraps they had in their pantry and they'd make burritos with it, or they'd send over non-perishable goods to the strike halls so people could eat. And then there's also people who used to pick it at supermarkets, right? Who could maybe come out on a weekend and join them on a march or pick up a sign and come out and participate in their struggle. And so that was the first kind of service. And that was an easy access point. Everybody could do it. You didn't have to have a whole lot to participate, just the will to want to help others. But then there was the other type of service, which was being a servant. And this was a deeper active commitment. And in this case, these were the folks who volunteered with him full time. When they first started, volunteers got paid $5 a week, plus they got room and board. Later on, it moved to $10 a week. And at the very end, they were getting $50 a week. And that was in the late 80s and 90s. Not a lot of money, as you all know, but these were folks who were totally committed to a struggle and would dedicate their lives to doing it. Now, being a servant could be a lot of the work that many of the folks in this room do here today, maybe sacrificing pay because they want to impact their communities in positive ways. And so, those were the two acts of service that he talked about. One of the things that I've learned just in reading and talking with folks about my grandfather, and one of the things that I've developed is that oftentimes we have these very limited views of what service is. Many times we think that service is simply going out and doing small acts of charity, serving food at the homeless shelter, community cleanups, and that's certainly a way to be of service. But there's a lot of other ways that you can be of service. I mentioned social justice here, the work of social justice and making that your full-time calling. There's social entrepreneurship. We at the Cesar Chavez Foundation consider ourselves social entrepreneurs. We do a lot of work in affordable housing, educational radio, and a lot of that turns what we call revenue over expense, or what the business world calls profit. But the idea that we have is that if we can build a strong, sustainable organization, then we can use the proceeds or those profits and reinvest that in the community to create greater good. So social entrepreneurship is another act of service. You can also do it through public service, working in government or working for nonprofits, even getting into elected office. I mentioned volunteerism already, and there's also philanthropy, and different types of service. But I think the other thing that I share with students, especially when I go out to schools and I share with college students, is that with this expanded definition of service, you can really grab any profession underneath the sun for the most part and make it a service-oriented profession. My grandpa used to say that everybody played an important part in the work of the movement, that the person who was working in the strike kitchen peeling potatoes was just as important as the organizers who were out there in the fields communicating with farm workers, and those organizers were just as important as he was when he was leading these efforts, that everybody had a role to play. It's really interesting because when I go out and I do my work, oftentimes people say, wow, Andres, you're doing such great work. But I know that my work is only possible with the team that I have. Everybody from the administrative assistants who make sure that the schedules look good and that we're getting our invoices paid and we're doing those basic administrative functions, right? To the HR team and the accounting teams and the legal teams. All of these people play an important role, and what they contribute to is us being able to help individuals and be of service. And so one thing I always encourage people to do is expand that definition of service and look beyond those simple acts of charity, picking up trash, but thinking about how can I live my life, which I think many of you all do, being of service to others. And so that's how my thought viewed service. The second one was participation. This quote comes from a letter that he wrote to the head of one of the big industries. And in it, he said, participation and self-determination remain the best experience of freedom. And free men instinctively prefer democratic change and even protect the rights guaranteed to seek it. But participation, what this speaks to was that when folks participate in the process, it's like they have some skin in the game. And because they have some skin in the game, and because they felt that their voice was heard, and because they felt that they were being acknowledged, that when it comes time to protect those institutions, when it comes time to protect those processes, those systems, that they're more willing to do it if they were able to participate in it. My dad had this fundamental belief in this fundamental faith in the goodwill of the American people. It was the reason why they started the Great Boycott. He believed that everybody had an opportunity to participate. He also believed in things like the Constitution and the democratic processes that existed here in the United States. And apart from having a belief in that, he also believed that people had a duty to participate in these systems. He often used to say, and there's a famous quote that I almost use, but I like this one a little bit better. But one of his most famous quotes was, "We don't need perfect political systems. We need perfect participation." And when it comes to participation, one of the things that we like to share with people is that you don't always have to be a citizen to participate, especially in our democratic process. When we think about policy, and I'm going to give this example later, calling your legislators, getting up and going on a march, volunteering for a campaign for somebody who's going to carry out the values that you believe in, are all ways for people, citizens and non-citizens, to participate in the electoral process and to participate in the civic and public affairs of their community. My tata often used to refer to the American public as the court of last resort, because he knew that if you could take a strong message to them, that people would participate. And I think that's true with a lot of folks' work. I imagine some of the folks here with the Antelope Valley Partners for Health, there was probably the big vaccine campaign drives and kind of COVID-19 education campaigns. It was really us going to the American people and asking for their faith that got us kind of over the hump and that we're still dealing with, but that was what really moved the edge was the people coming together to protect the societal well-being. Along with the court of last resort, my thought also he's talking about the power of people, that when people came together, they could be extremely powerful. And that was evident in his work, because when you looked at who farm workers were, they were the poorest of this nation's poor. Oftentimes they didn't come from the ivory towers, or they didn't have connections in Washington, but yet when they banded together and with fierce determination, they were able to be successful. And so that speaks to the power of participation, and all of us can make a difference. The last tenet that we think makes sense was this idea of empowerment. My Tata said, probably in his most famous speech that he delivered in 1984 at the Commonwealth Club of California in San Francisco. And if those of you who have read any of his writings or have seen some of his quotes, this is probably his most famous quote. But he said, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. My Tata Caesar used to say that his job as an organizer was to help ordinary people do extraordinary things. Oftentimes, he would convince people that they could do more than they thought they could do themselves. When he thought about who farm workers were and what their place was in the society when they were doing this work, people often looked down on them. A lot of them were poor, uneducated, many of them undocumented. Yet he helped people believe in themselves and told them that with hard work, anything was possible. Oftentimes, he would share with folks that you only lose when you give up. And there's countless stories that we've heard of people, whether it be the sons and daughters of farm workers or others, where they had conversations with him. One of my most famous was, there was this young Chicana out of Fresno County who had come up to my Tata Caesar and had talked with him and said, I really want to make an impact in education. I'm going to school at Fresno State to become a teacher. And he talked to her and he said, Mija, that's good. Go become a teacher. But as soon as you're done becoming a teacher, we need you to go be a principal. And she goes, well, I just need to get one step at a time. He goes, no, it's good. It's good for us to have teachers. But if we have principals, then we can really begin to impact the way the whole school operates. As a teacher, you can impact your individual classroom, maybe a little outside of that. But once you become a principal, you can impact more. She ran into him years later. And she said, Caesar, I finally became a principal. And he said, that's good. And all right, now it's time for you to become a superintendent. And she goes, no, I can't become a superintendent. I'm meant to be a principal. I'm meant to do this and that. No, you need to do this. And, they lost contact. He never got to meet her again, but we ended up meeting her later on, and she told us this story. And now she's the superintendent of one of the largest school districts in California. This was somebody who was the daughter of farm workers, somebody who didn't come from a rich or powerful family, but was empowered. She was the person who learned how to read and was no longer uneducated. And so I think a big part of civic engagement is empowering those around us. It's not merely enough for us to seek achievement for ourselves, but we have to seek achievement for our entire community. And part of seeking achievement for our entire community is making sure that if we have knowledge and information to share with others, and we have skills that we can share with others and that we can foster in others and develop in others, then it's our fundamental duty to do so. And by us doing that, we can create more strong and more prosperous communities. What people commonly refer to as empowerment is what we in the farm worker movement refer to as a Si Se Puede attitude. When we think about the work of the farm worker movement and the work of my Tata Caesar and others, if you look today, you would think that he was this wildly successful person. There's streets named after him. There's schools. You see murals, bearing his face all over the country. There's movies, all types of stuff. But the truth is that my Tata Caesar actually had more defeats than he had victories. But it was how he responded to those defeats that defined his legacy. What you're going to realize, and especially with the communities that most of us are passionate about, is that our access to the individuals who make decisions is a lot more hard to come by. We can't jump on calls and call powerful lobbyists and say, hey, can you make this backroom deal happen? No, we have to put boots on the ground and make things happen. And so, as we're participating in civic engagement, participating in these acts, I think the most important thing is that we have to know that there's going to be times when it gets to going tough, when you ask yourself the question, why am I doing this? But it's during those times that we have to remember all those who came before us and help pave the way so that we could have and enjoy the responsibilities and freedoms that we have here today. People like Dr. King, people like John Lewis, like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, people like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Sal Castro. Folks were talking about attending Cal State Northridge before the call started. The reason why many of us were able to participate in going to college was because the East LA walkouts that happened in 1968. And so it's important that we acknowledge that, but also understand that we have a fundamental obligation and duty to create more opportunities for others. And so that's my call to you all, is that civic engagement can happen a lot of ways, but we have to look at it with that service mindset. We have to become active. And as we become active and we participate, we have to remember to empower others along the way and create more opportunities for those who follow behind us so that we can create better and more prosperous communities. I'm going to finish talking about civic engagement in practice. This summer, there was a bill that was introduced by a senator out of Monterey County, and the United Farm Workers worked with him on this bill, and it was called the Agricultural Labor Relation Voting Choice Act. And this bill would simply expand the right for farm workers to vote for a union free from threats and intimidation, really giving them the opportunity to vote by mail. Most other folks, when they're voting for labor unions, are able to vote by mail. You've been seeing about the Walmart, you've been seeing about the Starbucks and Amazon strikes that have been taking place. These folks are able to vote by mail. There were certain laws that were passed that said that farm workers could only vote at the site of the workplace. And what was also taking place at the site of the workplace was that union representatives could no longer access the work site. And so essentially what would happen was that you would create these locations where farm workers would have to go into that were only, it would be like, the example that we like to give is, it would be like asking first-time voters to go and vote at the Republican National Headquarters, and maybe they were Democrats, or only allowing Democrats to go and vote at the Republican National Headquarters, or other things like that. And so what we saw was that there was a lot of threats and intimidation. People were often there was often threats about taking people's jobs, and so a lot of retaliation that took place. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to create a safer way for farm workers to vote in an election if they wanted to seek union representation. In 2021, they introduced this bill, and they decided that they were going to launch a march. And so they launched a march from Farmersville, California, to Sacramento. On the first day of the march, the bill had gotten out of both sides of the Assembly and the Senate, no problem. Got to the governor's desk, and after just about one day of being on his desk, and the day that the march started, they hadn't finished their 10 miles that day. And Governor Newsom called the president of the UFW and said, "We're vetoing your bill." Now, as I mentioned, the story of the farm worker movement wasn't a story that let their defeats define them. It was how they responded to those defeats that defined it. And so they went back to work, and they said, well, we're going to get a little bit more smart about how we're going to do this. And so they decided, we're going to launch a march from Delano to Sacramento. The UFW has only done 3 marches from Delano to Sacramento. The first one was in 1966, when my Tata Caesar and the early leaders of the farm worker movement launched that march. And that was some 400 miles because they zigzagged throughout communities to talk with farm workers and make it an organizing technique. The second march was in 1994, and that was the year after my Tata Caesar passed away. And it was to show everybody that even with him passing away, that this movement was still alive and strong. And so the fact that they were willing to take on a march of this length really showed their commitment to this bill. Furthermore, they did it in August. Now, I don't know how many of you know what the valley looks like and what it feels like in August, but it's constantly triple-digit heat. It was 335 miles over 25 days. And they started with about a few hundred people in Delano, California. And what we began to see is day by day, the march began to build steam. And part of the political tactics that they used was that they didn't allow the bill to get to the governor's desk. They worked with their friends in the House, in the Assembly and in the Senate, and they didn't allow for the bill to get to the governor's desk, because what happens is that this march can begin to build steam. Back in '66, when they started with less than 80 people. And by the time they got to Sacramento, there was 10,000 folks. In '94, they had similar numbers. And so they were hoping to have the same exact type of momentum created. And sure enough, that's what took place. It was interesting. I participated in the march in different ways. At first, I was just going out there and marching alongside them on the weekends when I had time, or if I had a day where I could get out there and go and march with them, I would do it. And then the president of the union called me and said, "Hey, can you leave your job for 2 weeks?" And us being a part of the farm worker movement, we'll always help each other out. She says, I'm having some trouble in Sacramento. I need some help with logistics. We need to get some permits for the final day. We need to build out a stage. We need to have all these things done. You need to work with Capitol Police. You need to do this and that. And so I became the point person on logistics for the final day of a march. We were expecting 5,000 people to join us. What we were surprised at was that 7,000 folks joined us on the streets that day. And it wasn't just farm workers, but these were folks from all walks of life, people who had a connection to farm workers, people who had people who maybe's parents were farm workers. But then there was also, medical students who came out, and there's all types of folk. It was incredible the amount of support that we saw. There's people who became civically engaged. They knew that they couldn't go out and march 14 miles because their day wouldn't allow it, but they'd pull over on the side of the road with waters and Gatorades. I kid you not, towards the end of the march, we wouldn't walk a half mile without somebody being on the side of the road waiting for us with waters, Gatorades, burritos, tamales, granola bars, oranges. One of the most powerful ones was there's a little boy who had seen the march taking place, and he told his mom, "I want to go do something," and he broke his piggy bank and he went and bought some granola bars to give it to us. Another example was there was this farm worker man, and he was in this old beat up truck, and we're marching, and it's hot as hell that day. We thought we were going to lose some people that day. That's how hot it was. I thought we were going to have fainting. We were walking, there was no shade. We're going from a small little dusty town in Northern California, marching into Stockton. And this farm worker guy pulls over in his beat up truck. He has a truck full of oranges, and he cooled them down, and he's there and he's cutting oranges for everybody, giving them to them. And he's pulling ahead every other quarter mile to make sure that we have water, we have oranges. And there was just countless examples of this. After the march, they still needed to make sure that this bill got signed. And so they went and they launched vigils in 3 different cities. And so people would come out after work hours and they'd come and do a prayer for the farm workers so that they could get this signed. And so again, they created ways for people to participate. What ultimately happened is the governor ended up signing the bill, and this bill will become law, and farm workers will have the opportunity to vote in union elections free of intimidation and free from threats. I wanted to show you all some pictures of what civic engagement looks like. I mentioned that anybody can participate, and you can see this little boy who wrote his sign and went out there with his mom and said, "Mis padres son campesinos y marchamos por ellos." My parents are farm workers and we're marching for them. There was other signs of little kids out there doing the same exact thing. You can see the farm workers who are marching. There's some farm workers in here that started off. A lot of these people, this woman on the right-hand side, undocumented farm worker, can't vote, but she participated and she's holding the American flag because she believed that she had a role to play in this democracy, and she certainly did. She'll be able to go on and tell her kids and her grandkids about this experience that she had, and she'll be able to say that she made history in this country. That was the belief that my Tata Caesar and that so many other had in the systems and the ability of this place. The lowriders. An interesting story about the lowriders. On the final day of the march, all the lowrider councils from throughout the country reached out from throughout the state reached out to us and they said, we want to participate. You had the Chicano bikers who wanted to participate too. We had over 200 lowriders join us on the final day. About 150 Chicano Harley riders all joined us. This picture was taken in just outside of Turlock, California. There were some white supremacists who were threatening to come and to potentially harm the farm workers. The lowrider community found out about it somehow. We don't know how they found out about it. I kid you not, I was on that day of the march. We leave our starting launching point at a park. We walk about a quarter mile, and right down the street, there's a line of about 15 lowriders waiting there. Some big homeboys jump out and they said, hey, our grandparents and our grandparents and parents were farm workers, and we're here to make sure that you get to Modesto safely. And so they escorted us all the way they rode alongside us the entire way. What was really cool was that same exact day, there was a Chicano Harley rider. The police were a little understaffed, and so the police deputized the Chicano Harley riders, and they said, okay, help us block traffic so we can get these farm workers and these marchers to Sacramento safely. And that's what they did. On the left-hand side there, you see the picture of all the women in red shirts. That was the CSU Stanislaus soccer team. One of the teammates and one of the coaches had an affinity with farm workers, and she convinced her entire team to come out and show support for farm workers. Again, this is a soccer team who probably should have been busy practicing, but they saw it as an opportunity for them to get involved. You see the people getting their feet treated. One of the things that you see on these marches is that you're walking on hot asphalt, and so your feet begin to blister. There was unions that represent hospital workers who were with us every step of the way. So every time we got into a location, there was somebody there working on feet. On the final day in Sacramento, there was this young woman from UC Davis Medical School. She got my number somehow. She called me and said, I have 40 medical students who want to come and be of service. And so they showed up and they were doing foot treatment for the farm workers. Not only that, on the final day of the march, I said, we really need you for the final day of the march. We need 5,000 people. They went to their dean and they said, we want to march with farm workers. And their dean said, yep, go do it. We're going to cancel classes for that day, or we're going to excuse you all to miss class that day. And we recommend you wear your white coats because it's important that white coats support farm workers. On the final day, I mentioned we got those 7,000 people, and here's just some of those images of it. Just kind of in closing, what I want to share with you all, and what I wanted these pictures to demonstrate, and what I wanted the history to demonstrate, is that all of us have the ability to be civically engaged, and we have an obligation to be civically engaged. Many of you do it on a daily basis, so I'm preaching to the choir here. But for those of you who may have friends or family who aren't as engaged, let them know that you can do it in the most simple ways, like taking out water to people who are struggling and being in marching, or you can join the march yourself, or you can make phone calls and write letters. This was really a collective spirit that got this bill to the finish line. The reports that we had read was that the governor was reluctant to sign it. But again, we went to the court of last resort. We relied on the power of people, and we showed that with hard work and fierce determination, anything is possible. And that's why when we hear the word Si Se Puede, it's not just a rally cry, but it's an embodiment of a spirit that we continue and that we take with us every single day and all the work that we do. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And I know we did have a couple of comments. Wendy, the village concept of rearing children is needed more than ever in times of uncertainty, yet I challenge the village to take stock of its wealth and resources in terms of its mental health and well-being. There's no health without mental health. Learning effective and healthy coping strategies for oneself and modeling for children and youth is another way of planting seeds of hope and empowering them to make healthy choices in order to live out their dreams. Thank you, Wendy. Did we have any questions, comments for Mr. Chavez? Some of you have been in our meetings, you don't have to take yourself off mute. You can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you at this point if you have any. Fran, I see Fran is taking herself off mute. Fran?
Oh, I want to go back on mute. Unmute.
Okay.
Anyway, I lived the experience with my parents, my mom, my dad. I was a baby myself. I'll give you a really quick short story. I was about 4 years old, and I had a sister that was 2 years old, and I had another sister that was 1 year old, and I had another baby as well. And my mother and my dad, that's what they used to go. They used to call the piscas, and go from farm to pick whatever fruit or vegetables or whatever is needed. And they would take us along, and we would be in a blanket on the side of the road. And I guess that's what gives me my strength now. I had to take care of my babies, my sisters, until they came back at the end of the day. But I have a lot of families that did work in Oxnard and Ventura and so forth. So I can say that I have had that experience. And thank you for letting me share that with you. And God bless you, Andres, for what you're doing. I did go one time to your grandpa's home, and it's what's the name of that road going up north? Anyway, to his home that they have, where he's buried and your grandma's buried.
Yeah.
And a nice place. It's a beautiful place. Thank you very much for sharing, Andres. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. I appreciate you sharing.
Thank you, Fran. Anyone else wanting to make a comment or have a story or want to share something or ask a question?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Andres, again, for being here with us. You continue living out your grandfather's wishes and work, and that's really impressive. When you think about where our society is in terms of, there seems to be a lot of that feeling of a lot of people think like, I don't care anymore, or things aren't going to change, things have always been this way. And to hear you speaking, I think, at least speaking for myself, it's very like the passion is still there, and you're bringing that, and it makes us it makes me feel like there's so much that we need to do. But as you look at that, and each community has its own need, and the Antelope Valley isn't the only one that has some severe needs, and a lot of like the health disparities that we deal with here, a lot of the racism that we deal with here. But like I said, you're giving us like just the to just go out there and do it. I'm never speechless, but I'm a little bit speechless right now. And but what would you say to, how do we get young children? How do we get the younger generations to really just feed into this and be a part of this?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I always go back to the idea of expanding with services, right? And I reflect back on kind of what my parents did with me. I have 3 brothers and sisters, so there's 4 of us. All of us have very different tastes and very different needs, and they never said, this is what you have to do. They never said, you need to move into this work. The work was large enough for us to be included in if we wanted to be included, and if not, that's what we needed to do. But what was impressed upon us was this kind of idea that what they would like us to do, however, is find something or find a passion where we could serve others, right? And that our work was leading to something that led to a greater good. And so I think that's the first place to start. I mentioned that, if a student has dreams of becoming, an attorney, attorneys certainly help folks on a daily basis if they do it with a service mindset. The same thing with doctors and lawyers, public health professionals. The list can go on and on. And so what I try to do is just impress that upon people, especially young people, is that, you don't have to be a Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta to serve people, that you can do it in all types of ways. One of the things of the Chavez Foundation is we don't really employ community organizers. Our work is a lot different. We have more folks who have MBAs and who went to, fancy schools that work for us than we do have community organizers, because our work is just different now. But all of these folks go into with the service mindset of wanting to use these degrees and use these skills to develop affordable housing complexes so that we can house poor folks, right? And so I think that's the best way to start getting folks involved. And then the other thing is that And there isn't any type of cause that we should push people into. People should gravitate to the causes that they're most passionate about. If young people are passionate about the environment, then let them explore that. Let them explore activism and advocacy on the issues as it relates to the environment. If farm workers is their issue, maybe they like a lot of different issues, but let them know that there's a lot of need out there and that there's a lot of ways to help. I think it is probably the best thing. And then as parents or as aunts and uncles or siblings, if you find yourself participating in something, just take somebody along for the ride and say, hey, come and do this. It was interesting. My girlfriend, her cousin, his dad is very involved in nonprofits and is kind of, when I talked to him, he said that in high school, he decided that he wanted to make a difference and he wanted to help people. And that's why he wanted to try doing work in politics and in government and whatnot. And that's what he made his career doing. But his son, was the opposite. And we had this march. It was the final day in Sacramento. He lived in Stockton. And the way that we convinced him to go out there is we said, well, you might meet somebody there, you might meet somebody. And sure enough, he met this young woman. They talked and they hit it off. They were from the same city. And so she convinced him to go to the final day of the march. And things didn't work out between them, but he told me after the march, he said, something came over me as we turned that corner and I saw the state capitol and I was marching with all these people. For the first time in my life, I realized that I was making a difference and I was doing something powerful. He's 30 something years old and he realized that. And the way that we got him out there is because we just asked him to tag along. And we told him that we'd buy him some beers after, right? So, it was that simple, right? That's what I recommend to people is just, make the work large enough for everybody to fit in and let them know they can contribute. The arts in music is another way that social movements have been able to share their work. And so if you have somebody who's an artist and they say, well, there's no room for me in activism. I don't like to talk. I'm more of an introvert. Hell yeah, there is. Go create some artwork so we can use art to tell our story, right? And I think that's a very powerful way to do it as well.
Thank you, Andres. It's you're very inspirational, and I appreciate you being here with us today for sure.
We have a couple of comments in the chat. Wendy, wonderful presentation. I'm inspired. Thank you for sharing your family's journey and lessons learned. I wish you the best. God bless. We also have Bridget sharing your Tata's story in comparison to it coming from a complete stranger. It hits differently. And also Estella, wonderful presentation. Also asking if we're going to be able to get that presentation. So I'll ask that of yourself because you're the.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. I can send it over.
Okay. And so do we have any other, again, if you wanted to put it in the chat or take yourself off mute, any other questions or comments for our presenter? And I'm just going to give it a couple seconds to see if anybody wants to take themselves off mute. And I'm waiting and I'm not seeing any. I know we did have another comment from Wendy. Looking at our gifts as a way of sharing ourselves in the world is showing gratitude to the Creator for giving us the gift of life. Thank you, Wendy. And so, okay, so I'm not seeing any others. So at this time, if we could all give Mr. Chavez a round of applause, virtual or actual. Thank you so much. I think this was a great way to start the third Policy Leadership Academy. So wonderful, such a wealth of information. I'm going to share my screen to just do a little bit of housekeeping.
Fran has something to say. Fran?
Real quick, I know we're speaking of youth and so forth, but I also want to make sure that everyone is aware that the seniors are having a lot of problems right now. And there's going to be, the president's supposed to be speaking this evening or this afternoon. I'm going to get on in a few hours, but because again, they're talking about our Social Security and I think I brought it up at the last meeting, our Social Security and our Medicare. So just keep that in mind also when we are all trying to do the best we can for this community, for our people. And our people, que sí se puede, because that was on my campaign papers and so forth that I backed, porque sí se puede. If you only try and you do it, but you got to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. We appreciate that. And yes, absolutely, our seniors are very important. Let me just share my screen. As I mentioned, we're going to just do a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll let you go. Group site. Sylvia, can you see my screen? Okay, great. So if you have joined the Policy Leadership Academy and you signed up, you might have received a couple of invitations for the group site. Group site is free. It's no charge to you at all. You just sign up, but it does give you a chance to meet the other cohort members, to download any of the flyers or anything from the meetings. And that's also where I will put the presentations. So this is a great chance to just interact. As you might have seen, I'll also post a discussion question after each cohort. So again, it's just a chance for us to kind of interact on a level outside of the meeting. And finally, I'm going to ask my colleague Stephanie to put our link tree in. This Policy Leadership Academy was brought to you by Best Start, First Five, Best Start Antelope Valley and First Five of LA, also Children's Bureau and AVPH. So this is a chance to really delve into Best Start. So we have our social media links, we have any of our trainings or sessions coming up there. So again, that is just a chance to kind of find out a little bit more about Best Start Antelope Valley. And then next week, we're so excited to have David Keitzman. He will be doing the strategic communication. Yay, we're going to be spending Valentine's Day together. And so that will be strategic communication next Tuesday. And again, you don't need to worry about writing anything down. You're going to get probably tired of seeing my email. You'll be getting an email a week before the module, a day before, and then an hour before. So be on the lookout for those emails. It'll also contain the Zoom link. So that's David. He's coming up next week. And finally, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found this as exciting, as informative as I did. What a way to start our first module with Andres Chavez, a civic engagement. So again, this is the first of 12 modules. We hope that you will continue to come back. We enjoyed having you. And again, take care, enjoy the rest of your week, and see you next Tuesday. Thank you so much, everyone.
Have a great day, everybody. God bless you all, and God bless America.
Thank you, Fran.
Thank you, Fran.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks a lot for everything,
You're
Wendy.
welcome. You're welcome. My pleasure. But you got